Hello, my name is Alex Kite. I'm an Environmental Health Officer at Cambridge City Council's residential team, and I'm here today to introduce Deirdre Cartwright from DAHA, the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, who is here to give us a presentation on domestic abuse in accommodation. Now, this session was recorded yesterday, and I'm having to do the introduction again today because due to a technical error, the first minute of the recording was not recorded. So if the webinar starts a bit abruptly, that is the reason why. So without any more to do, here is Deirdre with the presentation.
A very vital and unique lifeline for tenants. You may be the first or only person that they could disclose domestic abuse to. You could offer a simple yet very helpful response. You may be able to signpost them into local specialist domestic abuse services. And as I'll discuss throughout this 1 hour session, there are specific things that you can do as their housing provider to support them to be able to remain safely within their own home, if it is their choice and they are able to do so. But again, this is your decision as a landlord as to whether or not this is something that you feel comfortable and able to do at any point. So I'm just going to share my slideshow now so you can see it. Can everyone see that okay? I'm assuming you can. So just to start out by telling you a bit about Standing Together and the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance. So I work for Standing Together. We're a national domestic abuse organization, and we are focused on building what is known as the coordinated community response. And that's the concept that every professional, every member of a community has a role to play in supporting survivors experiencing domestic abuse and holding perpetrators to account. And it's a part of our commitment to the coordinated community, the response, that led to us to develop what housing sector's response to domestic abuse should look like. And in 2014, Standing Together co-founded the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance in partnership with Peabody and Gen 2 housing associations, which are two very large housing associations that you may have heard of. And this is a national initiative that was developed to improve the housing sector's response to domestic abuse. And through that, we have developed an accreditation process that social housing providers and local authority housing providers can gain by developing their policy and practice response to domestic abuse, which includes providing training for all of their housing officers and any member of their staff who may come into contact with tenants experiencing domestic abuse, developing policies and procedures and governance practices around domestic abuse so that every element of their organizational response considers the needs and circumstances of tenants experiencing domestic abuse so that they have the option to remain safely in their own home or to be able to relocate if they need to without lasting harm. And lastly, to be able to hold perpetrators to account. And by perpetrators, I mean perpetrators of domestic abuse or the ones causing domestic abuse. As a part of the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government has funded my role as the private rental sector development manager. And really my role is to go into quite uncharted territory of considering the specific needs of tenants in private rented accommodation and how those differ to those living in social housing, and to build a response to their specific needs that includes private rental sector landlords and letting agents, local authority teams, but as well as specialist domestic abuse services who advocate for the needs of survivors. Just to tell you a little bit about what I am going to be doing with you today. So there's kind of three things that I hope we can achieve by the end of this session. The first is to provide you some information so that you have a basic understanding of the domestic or the definition of domestic abuse and coercive control and how it impacts on the housing needs and circumstances of survivors of domestic abuse. The second is to support you to understand the vital and unique role of private landlords and letting agents in response to domestic abuse. And then the third outcome is to introduce you to DAHA's domestic abuse guidance for private landlords, which has been designed to support you to provide an appropriate response to tenants experiencing domestic abuse. So hopefully by the end of today, you'll have a very basic understanding of domestic abuse and how you can support tenants. And then it'll link you to this much more detailed guidance that we have developed that gives you a lot of examples around how you can support someone experiencing domestic abuse, and how to identify somebody who may be experiencing domestic abuse. So I thought it would be good to start out today with a bit of a quiz. So if you want to turn on your microphones, you can just shout out the answers or what you think might be the answers to these questions as they come up, and then we'll discuss what it really is. So the first question is, worldwide, what percentage of women who have been in a relationship report that they have experienced some form of physical and/or sexual violence by their intimate partner in their lifetime? Is it 1 in 3 women? Is it 1 in 4 women, 1 in 5 women, or 1 in 6, or sorry, 1 in 7 women? Does anybody have an answer that they think it is?
You can use the chat function if it's more comfortable, or you can just use your voices, whichever works better.
So I'll just shout out the answers as I go along then. So the answer is actually 1 in 3. So 35% of women globally have experienced violence, and this doesn't include emotional abuse, and it doesn't include sexual harassment or sexual violence. So really, when taking into consideration those other forms of violence and abuse, we assume that it would be much higher. So the next question for the quiz is, each year, how many women suffer some form of domestic abuse in England and Wales? Is it 500,000, 900,000, 1.6 million, or 3 million? So the answer is actually 1.6 million. So based on face-to-face interviews collected for the crime survey for England and Wales by the Office of National Statistics in 2019, it's 1.6 million women who have been experiencing domestic abuse. And then for each year, how many men suffer some form of domestic abuse in England and Wales? Is it 250,000, 800,000, 1 million, or 1.2 million? And the actual answer is just under 800,000 men experience abuse, but there is differences in how both women and men experience domestic abuse, which we will go into a bit more detail later. So next on the quiz, on average, how many women are killed every week in the UK by a partner or a former partner? Is it 0 women, 2 women, 4 women, or 8 women? So the actual answer is that 2 women a week on average are killed as a result of domestic abuse or by a violent partner or former partner. And we know that this number has actually gone up since the pandemic, because we know that domestic abuse has increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is probably the main area where we see a difference between how men and women experience domestic abuse. So women are more likely to be killed than men as a result of domestic abuse, and they're more likely to be killed by a partner or a former partner. This statistic in particular comes from the femicide census, which started out as a project called Counting Dead Women in 2011. But the annual census count in 2018 was that there were 149 women killed as a result of domestic abuse, and 147 men who were killed as a result of domestic abuse. In 61% of these cases, it was by an intimate current or former partner, and in 11% of these cases, they were killed by a family member. So the last question is, how many children experience child abuse in the UK? Is it 1 in 5? Is it 1 in 15? Is it 1 in 25? The answer is actually 1 in 5. So the crime survey for England and Wales estimates that 1 in 5 adults aged between 18 and 74 have experienced at least one form of child abuse, whether that's emotional or physical abuse, sexual abuse, or actually witnessing domestic abuse is a form of child abuse as well. And we know where there is domestic abuse, there is a significant risk of a child also being directly harmed by the perpetrator of abuse. So this leads into the next slide, which I think is a foundation for you to be able to have a better understanding of domestic abuse. It's best to start out with the governmental definition of domestic violence and abuse. And it's important to say that there is not currently a statutory definition of domestic abuse. This is a cross-governmentally recognized definition of domestic violence and abuse. And some of you may have heard that there is a domestic abuse bill currently going through Parliament. It's currently in the House of Lords, and hopefully with the passing of the domestic abuse bill, there will be a statutory definition of domestic abuse, which will expand on this current definition. So if I just walk you through the definition as it currently is. So domestic abuse includes any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive, or threatening behavior, violence, or abuse between those aged 16 or over who have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender or sexuality. So if you're an individual, a man or a woman who is 16 or over, and you have experienced any form of these types of abuse from an intimate partner or an ex-partner, whether that partner is a man or a woman, or a family member, including perhaps an adult child, a parent, a sibling, a cousin, an aunt, or an uncle, then that is considered to be a form of domestic abuse. And oftentimes the stereotype around domestic abuse is that it is simply physical abuse. But what we know is it is much more complex than that. And the majority of domestic abuse often doesn't include physical violence and abuse as the primary tactic of abusive behavior. So based on the governmental definition of domestic abuse, this encompasses psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and financial abuse. So psychological is affecting the way someone thinks and feels about themselves and about the world and about their relationship with the perpetrator, really attempting to isolate that person and create a dependency on the perpetrator. Physical abuse is quite self-explanatory. It's any kind of physical harm to the survivor of domestic abuse, whether that's hitting, punching, kicking, throwing objects at them, strangling them, or using a weapon against them, and ultimately the risk of killing them. Sexual abuse can be any form of sexual assault or harassment, any forcing of an individual to do something against their will or that they are uncomfortable with. And financial abuse is really restricting that person's access to the financial means to independence, whether that is controlling the money and the bank account, or even going a step beyond that. The new definition of domestic abuse that will become statutory will also include what's called economic abuse. And that's really controlling an individual's access to any resources that may allow them to gain independence within their lives, whether that is their ability to maintain a job, their ability to access transportation to get to that job, their ability to have their own bank account. Perhaps the perpetrator accrues rent arrears in their names or damages the property so that that money is taken out of their deposit. There are various ways and tactics a perpetrator will use to create economic dependence and economic difficulties that ultimately make it more difficult for that survivor of domestic abuse to leave that abusive relationship. In 2015, the Serious Crime Act introduced coercive and controlling behavior as a crime and as a recognized form of domestic abuse. So I'm just going to go into a little bit of detail about that. So controlling behavior is a range of acts designed to make a person subordinate and or dependent by isolating them from sources of support, exploiting their resources and capacities for personal gain, depriving them of the means and needs for independence, resistance, and escape, and regulating their everyday behavior. So it can be difficult for someone who is not have a lot of experience around domestic abuse to actually define what this behavior can look like. And that is because it's often very insidious and only recognizable to the person on the receiving end of this type of abuse, because it's the combination of various abusive tactics to keep that person isolated and to not have independence in their lives. And as I go through the next slides that describe the different types of abusive tactics that perpetrators use to have power and control over a survivor's life, it'll become clear how controlling behavior is perpetrated by abusers. And coercive behavior often sits alongside controlling behavior, and that's recognized as an act or a pattern of acts of assaults, threats, humiliation or intimidation or other abuse that is used to harm, punish, or frighten their victim. And the way I like to often think about it, for me to be able to understand the relationship between controlling behavior and coercive behavior, is controlling behavior is all of the ways that a perpetrator tries to control the various elements of their lives, whether that's cutting contact off from their family, whether that's having them stay at home and clean all day, or not allowing them access to a job or finances, or saying you need to have dinner on the table at a certain time, so that they are locked into this repeated cycle of subordination and entrapment. And then the coercive behavior fits alongside that as instilling fear into that survivor, and kind of instilling the knowledge that if you try to break this cycle of abuse, if you try to leave these abusive circumstances, there will be severe consequences for you at the end of that, which could threaten your life or the lives of your children, and really hurt your current circumstances. So hopefully, as I go through the next slides, it'll become more apparent how perpetrators use those different tactics of abuse. So in understanding domestic abuse, it's also important to recognize it within its gendered framework. So we recognize domestic abuse as a form of gender-based violence and abuse. And that is because we know that domestic abuse is predominantly experienced by women and perpetrated by men, although we do know that men are experiencing domestic abuse, both from male and female partners, and it can be just as threatening to their lives as the abuse experienced by women. But if you look at the pie chart that's on the screen in front of you, it shows you the proportion of women compared to men who experience domestic abuse. So around 1.6 million women experience domestic abuse in England and Wales, and that's according to the Office of National Statistics based on the Crime Survey. And comparatively, around 786,000 men are experiencing domestic abuse. So that's nearly 70% of women and around 30% of men. And not only do more women experience domestic abuse than men, but we know the way they experience domestic abuse is different to men. So as I stated in the beginning, women are more likely to be killed by an intimate partner or an ex-partner. They're more likely to experience various forms of domestic abuse that are interutilized to have power and control over that survivor. And we also know that the gendered nature of domestic abuse is really rooted in our society and the gendered discrimination against women that goes quite far back in our history. If you look at the fact that women historically weren't allowed to vote, they weren't allowed to own property, they were seen as property themselves within marriage. They weren't allowed to open bank accounts or have jobs once they were married. And it was only in, I think, around 1991 that rape within a marriage was actually considered a crime. So really what happens in a home and the power and control that oftentimes in an abusive situation men enact towards women is emblematic of what has happened in society as a whole and the power dynamics between men and women historically within society. And again, that isn't to at all diminish the experiences of men who are placed at risk of domestic abuse and whose own experiences are extremely devastating and significant. But we have to recognize the gendered constructs that domestic abuse exist within if we are to combat it. So this is this is a tool that is utilized oftentimes by domestic abuse practitioners who are working with survivors to help them to identify the abusive experiences they're having. And it's also used with professionals as well, for them to be able to understand how perpetrators utilize different forms of abusive tactics to have power and control over a survivor. So this is a model that was developed in Duluth, Minnesota, and it is called the power and control wheel, because at the heart of it is a perpetrator's need to establish power and control within the relationship. And stemming out from that power and control are the different tactics they will use to be able to gain that. So you have isolation, coercion and threats, economic abuse, intimidation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children, male privilege, and economic abuse, all as forms of domestic abuse to maintain that power and control. And this is a process of conditioning dependency and entrapment. And as you can see on the outside of that wheel is the continual threat of physical and sexual violence. And I think what is important to point out is that it isn't listed inside as one of these main forms of abusive tactics, because what we hear from many survivors is that for them, actually physical violence wasn't the most used or present form of abuse within their lives. The simple threat that the perpetrator was capable of physical violence was enough to keep them within that state of dependency and entrapment. So maybe the perpetrator would threaten them with violence. Maybe he would show them that he's capable of violence by punching a wall or throwing an object. Maybe he only had to hurt her physically one time to just demonstrate to her what he is capable of. And is that constant threat or that coercion that keeps control within that relationship. So when you think of isolation, that's things like having control over all of her interactions with the outside world, maybe regulating her emails, regulating her text messages, deciding who she can and can't have contact with, maybe creating a rift between her and her family or her and her friends, and making this image that it's the partner and her against the world and that they need to insulate themselves from outsiders. Coercion and threats are different threats that the perpetrator may use to keep her within that relationship. Sometimes it can be the threat to harm, the threat to kill themselves, the threat to commit suicide. There's the threat that if you leave, you will become homeless. If you leave, I will take control of all the finances. If you leave this abusive relationship, I will take the children off of you and gain full custody, or call child protective services on you and say what a bad mother you are. There's different means that they will use to maintain that power and control. Economic abuse is something I've already discussed previously, but it's having control over every economic resource that survivor might be able to access to leave that relationship, whether that's the bank accounts, the car, having a job. And again, in a lot of housing circumstances, it's doing things like accumulating rent arrears or debts or damages in the survivor's name so that they know they wouldn't be able to take that tenancy forward or leave and get another tenancy without them, and effectively making them homeless as a result of the domestic abuse. Using male privilege, so that that includes basically determining that you as the male are the head of the household and your rules are the rules of the household. It might be that the perpetrator expects dinner on the table at a certain time, the laundry to be done in a certain way, and if she's unable to do that, there'll be severe consequences. Using the children is something I've already mentioned about threatening to take the children away from her if she isn't able to remain within that relationship. But oftentimes the perpetrator will use the children as a bargaining tactic or turn them against her. So it may be that the relationship has ended, but the perpetrator is able to use child contact as a means to continue to stalk or harass the survivor of abuse, or they may turn the children against her and cause the children to believe that she's a bad mother, that she doesn't wish to protect them, that she is not intelligent or she is not capable, and really manipulating the children against her. Minimizing, denying, and blaming, really it's a tactic known as, often known as gaslighting, which is causing someone to believe that that they're experiencing and what is happening to them isn't real, and it's just made up and in their mind, or is actually their fault. Often perpetrators will convince the survivor that if only the survivor acted differently, then they wouldn't be abusing them, or it's because of my upbringing, or because my alcohol dependency or my anger management, that I'm unable to control what I'm doing, or actually what I'm doing isn't that bad and we really don't know what you're talking about. And really that sows a seed of doubt and blame in the survivor, which makes it difficult for her to believe that what she's experiencing is wrong, and that if she reaches out for support, she will be validated and she will be believed. And then using isolation is really cutting her off from all the support she could have, which is something I've already gone into, so I won't go into it again. But that's just to help you recognize why it can be so difficult for a survivor to be able to access support, and reach out and hopefully someday potentially leave that abusive relationship. But really it is a difficult and it is a dangerous path outside of that, and every day is a struggle to survive, and to not be harmed by the perpetrator. And it can be difficult for a survivor to see beyond that day-to-day circumstance. As a part of that, I just wanted to briefly introduce to you to a social theorist named Biderman. I never know if it's Biderman or Biederman, but he did a lot of work around understanding coercive control, and he came up with this theory around how perpetrators of abuse are able to establish control within their victims' lives. And he is established that they're able to do that when they create three things: dependency, debility, and dread. And as you will see from the circles outside of compliance, which is compliance with the perpetrator, are different abusive tactics that they will use, which overlap quite significantly with the power and control wheel. So they may use humiliation and degradation, saying how worthless they are, how undeserving they are of love, threats to kill, threats to harm, displays of absolute power, enforcing trivial demands. So the survivor may be so immersed in these trivial demands that they never have the opportunity to seek out support or see another way of life. My colleague, Judith, who works with social housing providers and gives quite a bit of training around it, for this example, often talks about a survivor that she worked with who was in a relationship with a perpetrator for many, many years. And one of his abusive tactics was that he would go off to work, and when he was off at work, she was at home, and she was expected to do quite a detailed list of chores to make the house clean before he returned again. And a part of that cleaning exercise was that he would hide around 10 £1 coins throughout the house. And he knew exactly which £10 coins these were, the codes on them or whatever it was. And at the end of the day, if through her rigorous cleaning she wasn't able to find those £10 coins, then there would be severe physical consequences for her. And she became so fixated, of course, on her daily survival, not being harmed at the end of the day, that she never had the opportunity to look and think about how she could ultimately leave that abusive relationship, because she was so exhausted by these trivial demands on her. And that links to the next one, which is around creating exhausted. They're so tired and so overwhelmed by daily survival that they can't think beyond it. And then occasional indulgences are really giving the survivor snippets of love and affection that may harken back to when they originally started their relationship with the perpetrator, and that might have been a loving, affectionate, seemingly healthy relationship. I think what's important to establish is that no one goes into an abusive relationship ever expecting it to be abusive. These relationships start off like any other, with two people who may be very much in love and infatuated with each other and want to spend much time together and bring their lives together. And it's as that relationship deepens and progresses and becomes more intertwined that those abusive behaviors might become more and more evident. And at the point at which all of these abusive tactics have been used and their lives are much more intertwined, whether they share property or they share children, or they're married, it becomes much more difficult for that survivor to leave. What is interesting about this theory that Biderman has created was that originally it was research that he had done around prisoners of war in Korea, and why that these prisoners of war were actually starting to side with their captors rather than going against them. Some people might refer to this also as Stockholm syndrome, and it's kind of where you're with the perpetrator for so long that you begin to, I guess, believe what they're saying and be able to survive within those situations and see them as the only way of life. And it's just an interesting theory to look at when considering the effects of domestic abuse. And another theory that is really a good one to understand the effects of domestic abuse is called space for action. And this is developed by an academic called Liz Kelly in 2014. And what she shows is that for someone who's in a healthy relationship with family members or an intimate partner, they have space for action. And that means space to be themselves, to think and do what they want, whether that's space to be able to decide what job they have, when they're going to leave the house, if they want to exercise, what clothes they wear, which friends and family members they want to interact with, and how and when. That is complete space for action. But it is through abusive tactics, in particular coercive control, that perpetrators are able to significantly diminish a survivor's space for action, so that she is existing at the very tip of that triangle, where she has no room to be herself because she is so focused on responding to the demands and the needs and existing in the circumstances of that perpetrator, so that she can survive and isn't even more harmed by them and their actions. So it is our role as professionals to support survivors to create space for action and to create mechanisms through which they can use to begin to think about what my life could be without the perpetrator, and to have the practical tools to be able to do that, whether that's alternative housing, whether that's specialist legal support, whatever the means is, we're there to provide the support to widen their space for action and be themselves, and be able to become safe from the perpetrator. So often in society, we ask the question, why doesn't she leave? And I think that we're all guilty of doing that at some point in our lives, where somebody we know, somebody we have worked with, is experiencing domestic abuse, and we can all see the harmful impact it has on the survivor and also the children. And we often, in frustration for the people that we care about, ask the question, why doesn't she just leave that abusive situation? It's something that I would never put up with, and I can't understand why she just doesn't walk away. And it's really important to think that survivors of domestic abuse are no different to you or me. Anybody can experience domestic abuse, and that the way that a survivor is behaving within an abusive relationship is the same as any of us would behave. And what they're doing is trying to survive in that relationship. And it can be very difficult and scary to try and find a way out of that abusive relationship. So they may have significant fears that if they try and leave the abusive relationship, that they will be harmed by the perpetrator. So we know that survivors of domestic abuse are at the greatest risk of homicide when they leave the abusive relationship. And that's because the perpetrator knows that them leaving is the ultimate threat to their power and control within that relationship. And their response to that is to kill them, to not allow them to leave that abusive relationship ultimately. So those fears that a survivor may have for leaving an abusive relationship are real and they are valid. But there's also other fears. There's fears of the unknown, fears of homelessness, fears of losing their children, their job, fears of uprooting themselves and having to leave their community, their schools, their home that they love. And those fears are real, and we know that they are real consequences of abuse. There's also the fear of not being believed. The perpetrator may have told them many times that they'll never believe someone else, a professional, will never believe them. There's a reason that abuse happens behind closed doors, where nobody can see what's actually happening. And we know that perpetrators are very good at presenting to society and to families and professionals as very kind and charming and charismatic, which it makes even more difficult for a survivor to be believed when they're coming forward. We know there's shame and there's embarrassment, there's low self-esteem and feelings of worthlessness. And there's also the matter that, oftentimes they do still love the person that is causing them harm, or the family, the intimate partner or the family member. And all of these things are preventing a survivor from being able to leave that abusive relationship. But also, we need to, as a society and as professionals, really change the narrative around how we view domestic abuse. And instead of asking the question, why doesn't she leave, to start asking the question, why doesn't he stop? Why is he abusing, his family member or his partner or his children? And what can we do as professionals to stop that? And to make sure that survivors are safe by ending or the abusive tactics of the perpetrator and holding them to account. And one way of doing that is being able to empower a survivor to be able to stay within their own home, and giving them the ability to be able to do that. Because far too often we know that the pressure is put on the survivor to leave that abusive relationship, and it's implied that they should be leaving their home, their community, their workplace in order to leave the perpetrator of domestic abuse, when really it should be the perpetrator who is having to suffer the consequences of abuse and leave those circumstances. So the impact of domestic abuse on survivors is significant when you think about their physical and mental health, their emotional well-being. I'm not going to go into details around this at the moment. As private rental sector landlords, I think it's really important to focus on the housing impact of survivors of domestic abuse. So the first thing to note is that the majority of survivors experience abuse within their own homes. And this is because this is where it's most effective. It's behind closed doors where nobody can hold perpetrators to account or question their behavior. And they may not believe the survivor if she comes forward and says, I am being abused, but no one has seen the effects of that. And we also know that the majority of survivors who are killed as a result of domestic abuse are killed within their own homes. So we believe a home should be a place of safety for anyone, but for survivors of domestic abuse and their children, oftentimes their home is the most risky place for them. So housing is the primary barrier to survivors leaving an abusive relationship. So we talked about many of the fears and practical barriers to survivors leaving an abusive relationship. But for many, they know that if they leave this relationship, they will become homeless as a result. And we know that there are many reasons for that. We know that it can be difficult for survivors to access refuge and emergency housing accommodation. But we also know that there are many legal barriers to survivors being able to stay within their own home. We particularly know that for survivors who share a joint tenancy with the perpetrator, it can be very difficult for them to be able to remain within that own home without actually ending their own tenancy and therefore making themselves and the perpetrator homeless, or having to go to the perpetrator and ask their permission to leave that tenancy, which, as you can imagine, can be a very threatening and difficult circumstance for survivors. We know that rent arrears and damages and economic abuse can make it very difficult for survivors to either maintain their own tenancy or to gain a new accommodation. We know that there is a significant link between rent arrears, antisocial behavior, and evictions for survivors of domestic abuse, which I will go into more detail later. And as a result of these barriers, we know that domestic abuse is the leading cause of homelessness for women and children. So predominantly, if a woman and her children are to leave an abusive relationship, they are expected to leave their home, make themselves homeless, and uproot their lives. And we know, as I just said, domestic abuse is strongly linked to rent arrears, damages, and evictions, which lead to the long-term homelessness of survivors and their children. And we know this is a purposeful tactic used by perpetrators as a form of economic abuse, and as a form of physical abuse as well. We know that there'll be holes in the walls, there will be broken locks, there'll be broken windows as a result of physical violence. But there's also something more tactical in that, of creating these damages and these economic situations where the survivor is in more financial debt and unable to leave that abusive relationship. So this now leads into what is your role as a private rental sector landlord. The government has strongly campaigned that domestic abuse is everyone's business. For a long time, it was seen that domestic abuse, first of all, is a private matter, and that what happens behind closed doors is no one else's business besides those who live within that household. But as you know from the beginning of this session, the effects of domestic abuse are catastrophic. And when women and children and men are being killed as a result of domestic abuse, it should become everyone's business to have a response to domestic abuse. There was a man named Timothy Brown. Timothy Brown was a tenant in, I believe it was social housing. He was living in a flat. Timothy Brown had heard some noises from his neighbor Natasha's flat that he found concerning, and what sounded like screams and yells and her being assaulted. And Timothy Brown was concerned, but he didn't know what to do. So he called his father and asked his father what he should do, that he was concerned about his neighbor and what could be happening to her. And his father said, look, it's not your business. You know, just ignore it. Don't do anything about it. You don't want to get involved in other people's business, and just let it go. So Timothy took his dad's advice. He hung up the phone, but he continued to hear really disturbing sounds coming from his next door neighbor. And he was so disturbed by what he had heard that instead of calling the police, he recorded what he was hearing. And the next day, Timothy got a knock on his door from the police, and he was informed that his neighbor, Natasha Bradbury, had been murdered by her abusive partner. And that, in fact, what he had recorded the night before was her being assaulted and ultimately killed. Timothy Brown really recognizes that, you know, it's a he is not responsible for what had happened to Natasha Bradbury for her murder, but that he could have had a role to play in potentially preventing that murder in that moment, and that we have to change the narrative in society that domestic abuse is a private matter and that we have no business intervening. And we know people are losing their lives as a result of abuse, and therefore we all have a role to play. And we know from domestic homicide reviews that housing providers in particular can have a very unique and vital role to play in the response to domestic abuse. You may be the only person who may be able to spot the signs of abuse. You may be the only person that that survivor is able to disclose domestic abuse to. You may be able to give them a response that is empathetic and believing, and therefore gives her the confidence to go forward to other professionals. And you may be able to refer her to specialist services, or even think about ways that you can help her stay within her housing if it's safe to do so and within your benefit as a landlord as well. So within the guidance that we've developed for you as private rental sector landlords, goes through what domestic abuse is and how you might be able to identify it, but really what your role in the response can be. So we believe that private rental sector landlords can potentially identify those experiencing domestic abuse, either through spotting the signs of abuse or through receiving disclosure from a survivor who may be experiencing abuse. And the guidance goes into detail about what some of those signs of abuse may be, whether it's you've seen concerning or controlling behavior from the perpetrator in front of you. Maybe the survivors have to ask permission to do something, just use the toilet or make a cup of tea. Maybe you've noticed that she's requested the locks to be changed several times, or that there's been damages to the property that seem inexplicable, or that there are sudden rent arrears. There are ways for landlords to be able to identify domestic abuse, or simply the survivor may have just said to you, I'm very fearful of my partner, or said a snippet of something that he's done that you found concerning. And the guidance goes into detail about how you can start a conversation with that survivor about what you're concerned about, and let her know that you care and that you want to offer her some form of support, not as a specialist, but as a landlord. And then that you can signpost them on specialist services and offer housing-based solutions. So some examples of helpful responses for you as a private landlord. So before you ever talk to a survivor about their experience of domestic abuse, whether they're disclosing or you've spotted some concerning behavior, just make sure that they are alone and that they are safe before discussing the abuse. The best thing, I mean, the most important thing is to make sure that the perpetrator isn't there and that children aren't there who would bear witness to some probably distressing descriptions. So being alone is important. It's important to also ask open questions about the concerns that you may have. Sometimes professionals simply ask the question, are you experiencing domestic abuse? And that survivor may not recognize that they're experiencing domestic abuse. They might not know what domestic abuse is. But if you talk about them openly about some of the concerns you have and ask them about that, that might just open up a conversation that could lead to a disclosure, and the guidance provides details around that. We don't expect you to be a specialist in domestic abuse. We don't expect you to do special safety planning or risk assessments with them. All that we would say that you should do is to be able to listen to them, to believe them, and to validate their experience. They may have been told by the perpetrator for many years that what they're experiencing isn't abuse, that they deserve it, and that no one will believe them. But if you simply listen to them, say that you believe them, and say what's happening to them is not their fault and it's wrong, that is a huge step for them in being able to come forward and access support. And then, of course, if you believe that there is an emergency, that someone is being immediately harmed, you can ask them to call 999. And if they're unable, you can call 999 yourself. There's nothing stopping you from doing it, and we encourage you to do so in the case of an emergency. And at the end, within the guidance, there is an A4 sheet that you can provide to your tenants that have a list of national domestic abuse services and helplines. And also you can go on your local authority website and find out what the local domestic abuse services are, or approach the environmental health team and they can link you in with the local domestic abuse services, which you can provide to your tenants. And then you can offer housing-based solutions. If you feel that you're capable of doing that, if you feel like you want to and it's within your remit, there's no obligation for you to be able to do that as a private landlord. But we have worked with many private landlords who have offered various solutions for the survivor to be able to remain safely within their own home. So some examples include just simply giving your consent if it's legally viable, for the survivor to be able to change their locks or get enhanced security measures. So almost all local authorities or police offer free services to survivors of domestic abuse to have their locks changed and to have additional security measures for after the perpetrator may have left the household or if they've never lived there, so that they can feel safe within their own property and deter the perpetrator from coming to their home or entering the property. And that's no cost to you as a landlord, but oftentimes, not oftentimes, all the time, the local authority, the police have to gain your consent to be able to do that. And that is just a small way that you can help a survivor to be able to stay safely within their own home without a cost to you as their landlord. So as I've said before, lots of times perpetrators will accrue rent arrears or damages as a form of domestic abuse. And if you're able to do so within your role as a landlord, you can offer creative ways for them to be able to address those rent arrears and damages, whether that's paying off rent arrears incrementally over time. Perhaps those damages can be covered through your property insurance. Different landlords have offered different ways to address this. And it just depends on what you're willing to do and what your circumstances are as a landlord. The last is that considering offering the survivor their own tenancy if they are forced to end the tenancy with the perpetrator to have them removed. So what I've said before is there's often a huge barrier for survivor is when they share a joint tenancy with the perpetrator, which, as you probably already know, means they're seen as a single legal entity. And in these circumstances, the perpetrator or the survivor could end that entire tenancy without the other tenant's consent, making them both homeless. However, if you want to keep that tenancy but remove the other party, you have to gain their consent to do so. And this places significant power in the hands of the perpetrator to either end the survivor's tenancy altogether or force the survivor to end her own tenancy to then start a new one and make herself homeless, or get a perpetrator's permission for him to leave, which often she's too fearful or unable to do for very valid reasons. So what oftentimes can happen and what other landlords have been able to do is to have that open discussion and dialogue with the survivor about what would be helpful for them, and whether or not, if that tenancy were to be ended with the perpetrator, whether or not they would be able to start a new tenancy with the survivor as a sole tenant. That depends on what the survivor wants, what the survivor needs and is safe for them. And of course, it depends on what's affordable for that survivor, whether their employment or they're able to access benefits to make up that rent, or they have other means to be able to cover the rent, that's for you and the survivor to discuss, but it could be an option to allow them to stay safely within their own home. And what's also important is to never confront the perpetrator. This could put the survivor at a significant risk of harm. And it takes trained professionals to be able to interact with the perpetrator and hold them to an account in a way that is safe and effective. And what we advise is just to never confront the perpetrator about the abusive behavior, because of the risk that it could present to the survivor and the children. Because as I've said throughout, it's about that power and control and about that isolation of a survivor. So if they know that she has been able to come forward and engage with a professional, that she is seeking ways to potentially escape that abusive situation, that could put her at a risk of harm when he knows she is trying to attempt to separate. So all of what I've shared with you today is covered in the written guidance that we have provided for private landlords to be able to access when they may have a tenant who might be experiencing domestic abuse. So the guidance provides information and advice about how you can support your tenant experiencing domestic abuse so that they can maintain stable housing and live safely and overcome abuse and its harmful impacts. It recognizes that you as private landlords are vital partners in the response to domestic abuse, but you are not expected to provide in-depth support to tenants or be experts in domestic abuse or act outside of your professional remit or what you feel capable or willing or comfortable to do. And as landlords, the guidance provides you with information and advice on how you can identify, respond, refer, and support tenants experiencing domestic abuse in much more detail. And within the presentation, I provided various links for you, including a direct link to the guidance, which will also attach to the email that we'll be sending afterwards. We'll also be sending the slides here and a recording of the webinar. There's a web link to the private rental sector page of the DAHA website, which includes a lot more guidance for private rental sector landlords, in particular guidance on how to support tenants in COVID-19. The Cambridge City website will also provide links to the guidance. And then my contact details are there as well. If you ever wish to get in contact with me, please feel free to do so. I would love to have your input and your feedback, or just share with me your experiences as landlords, and whether or not you've ever been faced with the situation of trying to support a tenant experiencing domestic abuse, and maybe some of the barriers that you've come across or some of the solutions that you've been able to develop with the survivor, so that we can share that with other landlords as well. And that is the end of my slideshow. So I will just exit out. Yeah.
Right, thank you, Deirdre. That's been great. Much appreciated. So, as you say, we're going to send out an email afterwards with a link to the recording of this webinar, so you can review it again in case you missed anything, and also a link to the guidance. And so yeah, keep an eye out for that email, and they'll be producing more like this in future. And if you do have any questions, if you can either email them to myself or Deirdre, that would be great, and we can answer them at a later date. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.